Greetings, everyone. I'm Mohammad Tabakoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to this special session of Iranian Studies book launch featuring our distinguished Professor Claudia Yaghoobi and her recently released book, Transnational Culture in the Iranian Armenian Diaspora, which was published earlier this year by Edinburgh University. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful for having the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. An Iranian studies scholar, Professor Yaghoobi, is an innovative scholar of Iranian culture, literature, gender, and sexuality studies, focusing on the numbers of sexual, ethnic, and religious minoritized population. Currently, the director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at North Carolina University. She's the author of numerous stellar articles and several books, including Subjectivity in Attar, Persian Sufism and European Mysticism, which was published by Purdue University in 2017, and Temporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politics in Modern Persian Literature and Films, Cambridge University 2020. Today, Professor Yaghoobi will speak on her new groundbreaking book, Transnational Culture in the Iranian Armenian Diaspora. I must also note that she had another book recently released on the Iranian Me Too movement. Professor Yaghoobi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Tabakoli, for this invitation, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to thank also your team who have been working tirelessly over the past couple of days. I know everyone is exhausted. I'm going to read parts of the book, and I'm going to read some of the personal parts of the book, personal vignettes, and then some of the more literary scholarship or the artistic ones. Okay. I think we're good. I am going to start with the reason behind publishing this book, which is the prologue of the book. I was born in Firuzgar Hospital in Tehran on November 20, 1974. The first of 4 children. My birth as a girl was not too appealing to the family, as it is a common Middle Eastern mindset. For the first 8 years of my life, I grew up with my extended family, grandparents, aunts, and an uncle in the same house in the Heshmatieh Mardash neighborhood, in a single room with my parents. My oldest brother was born in 1978, but it was not until my sister was born in 1982, in the early years of Iran-Iraq war, that we moved to our own rental apartment in Karim Khanezand near Haftetir. Later in 1984, my father managed to receive loans from banks to purchase his first ever property in the Heshmatieh neighborhood, where my grandparents used to live. Much of my childhood was spent in this house until we moved to a new house in a new neighborhood in Narmak Eastern Tehran in 1989. My mom tells me that she knew I was an old soul even from the very first years of my life. I was so mature compared to my peers, she says, but I wonder if much of this maturity was because I did not enjoy a carefree childhood. As the oldest of four and looking after my siblings, I was always given more responsibility than my peers. My younger brother was born in 1989, right after the war had ended and Khomeini had died. The Iran-Iraq war was an enormous blow to my childhood and to everyone else's life in the country. One of my second cousins was the first Armenian martyr in the war, and another second cousin was held as prisoner of war in Iraqi prisons until 1990. I was 6 years old when the war began and 14 when it ended. The trauma of the war remained with me in recurring nightmares and somatic trauma responses for decades after it had ended, until I began teaching a course on wars and veterans at the UNC Chapel Hill in spring of 2017. I still teach this course every year because talking about wars and telling stories help us heal our deep wounds. At the beginning of the war, Khomeini would appear on TV regularly with propaganda and mobilizing announcements. I was a child, and my only reaction was fear after seeing a bearded old man talking about war. My family has always been apolitical, if that is even a thing. However, they could not tolerate watching this highly Islamized TV. My grandmother cursed him every time he came on the screen. The only statements appealing to my working class family in all of this were the promises of lower costs for basic needs, which were never realized. As the war progressed, we quickly learned that the state TV would announce the approach of Iraqi airplanes over Tehran skies with a danger siren and their departure with a peace siren. In Persian, the sirens indicating danger was called red siren or ajir qermez, and the peace one was white siren or ajir safid. Hearing the red siren, we were required to take shelter. I remember that we would run with my parents and brother from our second floor apartment to the first floor or the basement of the building to take shelter. I was so scared of the Iraqi airplanes dropping bombs on our house in Tehran that every time the red siren sounded, my eyes would become two big black saucers. Seeing my reaction, my parents decided to move the family temporarily to Rudehen, a suburban area an hour east of Tehran, beyond the reach of Iraqi bombs, or so everyone believed at the time. However, the war lasted for 8 years, and so it was impossible for our family to stay on the outskirts of Tehran, renting apartments, staying with family or friends, or putting up tents in people's backyards. This kind of lodging was debilitating during the winter months when it was so cold, especially at night, that my cousin and I had to take turns all night placing our feet between each other's legs to keep warm. Thus, we alternated between Tehran and Rudehen, sporadically living in each city for 8 years. I have vivid memories of a few instances when Iraqi missiles hit Tehran, so close that our windows shattered. My father took my siblings and me to one of these spots where a missile had hit and demolished an entire neighborhood. This was northern Sabalan near Tehran. I could not understand at the time why my father had taken us to that site of destruction, where lives had been lost. It left an exceptionally traumatic mark on my psyche. He only said that I would understand later that I needed to grow resilient. Although I did not know it then, he was referencing the millennia-old entrenched resilience of Armenians who had fought, struggled, persevered, and survived so many wars, conflicts, and a genocide. Today, I fully understand it, and while the sight from that day still remains in my psyche, I am grateful for that first lesson in my ancestral resiliency. The war was specifically difficult because during its first few years, nobody knew that it would last for 8 years, and so life went on. The economy had collapsed, and food was rationed, and this struck us sharply. I stood in lines with my grandmother and mother several times a week to buy our share of butter or margarine for that week. I vividly remember standing in lines to buy cigarettes for my grandfather. For some reason, cigarettes had become rare. This was strange because Iran is a tobacco growing country to this day. While we stayed in Rudahan, my dad had to go back to Tehran for work, and we constantly needed to retrieve essentials from our home in Tehran. All of these things required that my dad make trips back and forth, which was very traumatic for the entire family because we never knew when or where the next missile or bomb would hit. During the final years of war, schools shut down all year, but still conducted the final exams in June. I was in middle school at that time, so for the final exams, my dad would drive me back to Tehran to take the test. My school, Kushesh Middle School, was located near the Russian embassy in Tehran. During our exams, the teachers would constantly remind us that the Iraqis would never come near that neighborhood because they would not want to mess with the Russians. This was their way of reassuring us that we were safe. What they did not consider was that we were worried about our fathers who had taken us to the city to take the exams, but were not necessarily staying in that neighborhood for the entirety. The guilt of putting my father in danger all those weeks as I took the exams as a 12-year-old child remained with me for decades. The war ended in 1988. My little brother was born in 1989. We moved to a new house in a new neighborhood in Narmak and hoped that this would be the end of our struggles, but alas, it was not. As Armenians who have survived much hostility at various historical junctures, it would prove an illusion to believe that life would become easier now that Islamic Republic was beginning to consolidate and prove its legitimacy via various exclusive policies. An enormous wave of Armenian immigration to the West, particularly to the US, began immediately after the war broke. My maternal aunt's family, with whom I was very close, were part of this wave. They left in 1986. My aunt and uncle insistently encouraged my parents to take that leap of faith with them. But alas, my father was not ready to do so, as he had just purchased his first ever property in Iran. This is not an unusual predicament for a minoritized population, especially from a working class segment of society that has had to work so hard to secure the basic rights that their majority counterparts have had since birth. In part, this applies to work and employment opportunities available to the majority as well. It took us years to conclude that we wanted to leave. Human rights associations such as HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, would take applications to help us get to the US as a Christian minoritized family from a Muslim majority country. But we were not to be so lucky, right? We submitted our application to HIAS in early September 2001. A week or so before the World Trade Center was hit and all immigration to the US was suspended until 2005. When the process resumed in 2005, my family's application was one of the first. 4 months later, we left Iran on April 29, 2006 for Vienna, Austria. We stayed in Vienna for 4 months. They kept my parents and my younger brother to check my father's military background. Were interviewed in the US Embassy, received our visas, and arrived at the Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, on August 17, 2006, exactly 17 years ago. I left Iran for the US after a horrific experience I had with the morality guard of the university as a tenured faculty. At the time, I was a tenured associate professor in the English Literature Department of Azad University in Budahan. The guard stopped me in front of my colleagues and students and asked me to wipe off my lipstick. Mind you, they had hired me with that same appearance. I told them that I was faculty. The next thing I heard was, "We do not care who you are." The disrespect was so deep that I ended up not being able to teach that day. There was a big lump in my throat all day long. The chair of my department complained to the president of the university, and I received a formal apology by the end of that day. But something had broken in me, between me and the existing Iran. Immediately after I came home, I decided that I would leave Iran, and this is when exactly our application had been approved. My family was still in Iran only because of me. I was a university professor, had just bought my own apartment, and led a successful life, not easy for a Christian woman in Iran, doubly minoritized. My parents were happy for me and did not want to disrupt my life with migration. But the moment had come, we had to leave. 4 months later, I was in Vienna, Austria, waiting for my visa to fly to Los Angeles. In the US, I moved several times from city to city and state to state. Today, when asked where home is, I first get confused. Sometimes I even consider Los Angeles my home, when in reality, I want to refer to Tehran. Today, I think about home in the globalized world in which we live, where geographical borders matter little. However, even this hybridity and transnationalism or globalization come with their own limits. I'm a hybrid individual of this diaspora with multiple consciousnesses. And what I have shared with you here about my personal life is based on fragmented memories, etched deeply by wounds and trauma that are still provoked but are in the process of healing, since healing never ends. So the reason for writing the book was at the conference, AIS conference, Association of Iranian Studies, in 2018, I was invited to a panel on Iran-Iraq war to talk about Iranian Armenian contribution to the war, because I have felt it, I have experienced it in my own family, my cousins. I tried to do research and I could barely find anything in the history or in documentations about Iranian Armenian contributions. So later, I decided to focus my attention on documenting Iranian Armenian contributions to the cultural landscape of Iran. So since the war was not only a turning point for all Iranians, but more specifically for Armenians and for myself regarding mass migrations and diaspora to the West, it indeed prompted me to write this book to acknowledge my Iranian and Armenian legacies. So when I was writing the book, I received a semester of fellowship And during this fellowship, Institute for the Arts and Humanities, during this fellowship, we were supposed to present our work to our co-fellows. And at the time, I did not have a hook for the introduction. I didn't know how to, I mean, the way that I began the introduction at the time did not sound appealing to my co-fellows. And exactly at the time, I had ventured out and done my ancestry DNA. And I presented the ancestry DNA to my co-fellows, and they were like, this is your hook. You have to start with this, which proved to be a very rewarding experience, because starting with the ancestry DNA analysis, it took me down this rabbit hole of also historical documentation of my ancestors. So that's what I want to read a little bit for you. I received and this is my picture with my parents when I was 3 years old in Tehran. And I don't know, I have all these different facial gestures as a kid. I mean, this looks like I'm carrying the entire world on my shoulders. 3 years old, I'm not sure why. I received my ancestry DNA kit on February 19, 2021, and the results on April 5th, 2021. It took me years to muster the courage to order it. There are rumors, or perhaps true, about the DNA collections and DNA banks by governments. I had been thinking about my ancestry for some time, but it was not until I became deeply immersed in writing this book that I really felt the urge and the calling to send in the kit. The results estimated my ethnicity as follows: 84% Anatolia and the Caucasus, 12% Iran or Persia, and 4% Cyprus. I clicked on the results page and I'm taken to another page with some descriptions and maps. Anatolia and Caucasus are located in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, and it is defined as follows: a physical bridge between Europe and Asia. This region has seen empires, Greeks, Persians, Romans, Ottomans, come and go for thousands of years. However, Iran and Persia is described as located in a few countries in the Middle East, including Iran. And Cyprus is marked primarily as Cyprus, but it was also a region which the Phoenician, Persian, Egyptian, Roman, and Byzantine empires have each claimed. All three categories are somehow included in each other's definitions, including migrations to and from regions. And this is because DNA profiles nowadays use geopolitical borders familiar to us in the modern world and not at that time. In short, the profile indicates that my ancestors come from the Caucasus region, probably historic Armenia. They were uprooted from Armenia to Iran, and this is how I come to be Iranian Armenian. As I examined my DNA results, I first noticed all the movements and the fact that my ethnicity involved 3 different regions and countries rather than one. My Iranian Muslim friend tells me that she has one category, and that's Iran. This means that my ancestors most likely moved through that area many times, even if only to a limited extent, and probably in a circular fashion. The exposure to various cultures in these regions with different languages and dialects may also account for certain linguistic skills, a special talent where the brain stays more malleable than the norm, which we have in my family. The movement across regions that resulted in such mixed DNA clearly demonstrates many ancestral uprootings and displacements. As they move through, into, or out of a space, as merchants or traveling scholars and teachers, or a displaced community, they probably picked up new people through intermarriage, immigration, religious practice, free or forced sexuality, and other sources that consequently infuse a great deal of diversity. Later on, Ancestry DNA gives you all these updates later, and later it gave me updates that on the side of my paternal side, there was some intermarriages or mixes with Iranians at some point in history, not on maternal side. The genetic diversity that emerged from interactions with new people was also reduced and narrowed, however, by events such as war, famine, genocide, and disease. Naturally, they took what was left and continued moving, which led to a new and different kinds of diversity. Second, I noticed that my ethnicity was predominantly within the Caucasus, which also corroborates this book's argument. It demonstrates that Armenians endeavored to maintain the core of their Armenianness and heritage, even through multiple displacements and forced assimilations within their host nations. The fact that Armenians have been displaced forcibly several times has had an immense impact on their collective consciousness as a population that has never felt a complete sense of belonging within their host nations. So that core of Armenianness and maintaining the heritage and the core is because of all those displacements and because they feel like they're on the edge of losing their existence. It's kind of existential for them after the genocide and right now with the Nagorno-Karabakh case. My ancestors were most likely part of a group of Armenians displaced by Shah Abbas to Mir-Djalali, part of the Iranian city of Isfahan in the 17th century. They later migrated to Iraq, Ostan Markazi, and finally to Tehran. Many of the Armenians who ended up in Iraq were displaced by Shah Abbas from Western Armenia's Van region, which is in historic Armenia. Sources have documented that they later migrated from Mir-Djalali to other cities, including Iraq. In Iraq, a group of these migrants settled in the Gurezar village of the Kazaz region, and my ancestors were part of this group. The first documented Armenian named Murad, or they would call him Armenian Murad, because Murad is not Armenian name. Obviously, they would add Murad Armani, resided in Gurezar in the 1800s with his grandchildren. According to Hovik Minasyan's oral history fieldwork, in 1894, Avedis Torosyan moved from Mir-Djalali, Isfahan to Iraq to begin working at the Hudson Company. Gradually, between 1902 and 1903, others joined him there. They moved to Iraq in part because a branch of the rug-making Ziegler Company had been established in Iraq. Many artistic Armenians and craftsmen moved there to work for Ziegler, were hired, participated in the rug industry, and amassed wealth. In 1905, 8 families, that is 27 persons, lived in Iraq, Armenians. But by 1913, this number had risen to 15 families. Armenians had a significant impact on the rug industry in Iraq. In the absence of a family tree, I cannot determine when my ancestors migrated from Mir-Djalali to Gurezar in Iraq. I only know that they were among the displaced of the 17th century, and that my paternal and maternal great-grandparents were in Gurezar at the time of 1915 genocide. So in 1915, we were not in one, because if we were in one, I would be a survivor of genocide, basically, but we were not. As it is with most immigrants, not everyone who moved from Mir-Djalali to Iraq was fortunate enough to be hired in the rug and carpet weaving industry. My great-grandparents engaged in farming, gardening, and ranching, and they led a traditional lifestyle. My father tells me that my great-grandfather, Jahangir Khan, was the chief or Kat Khoda of Gurezar village, who for some reason, at some point, ceded all of his power to his brother Qassem and donated his wealth to the poor. Why? and then became the working class family. But a funny story here is that I had asked a couple of friends and colleagues to review the manuscript and give me feedback. And one friend, right in front of this part, had written, okay, now we know where your social justice and human rights thread comes from, your great-grandfather. So his name was Jahangir Khan, his brother Qassem. As you notice here, my great-grandfather's name, Jahangir, and his brother's name, Qassem, are not typical Armenian names. This is the evidence of the historical influence of Iranian culture and how names were translated by name or birth registrars from Armenian into Persian or even Arabic to make them sound more local. Both of my parents were born in Gurezar. How and when they moved to Tehran is unclear. My dad says he was 10 years old, as they do not remember exact dates. From the dates they do remember, this migration to Tehran was most likely not part of the Armenian Nergah, which is the post-World War II Soviet policy of repatriation of the Armenian community, which means that my great-grandparents did not intend to return to Armenia. In Tehran, both families resided in Heshmatiye Mardash neighborhood. What I know with confidence is that at some historical juncture, my ancestors, who were probably from one region of historic Armenia, were forced into displacement, relocated to New Jolfai in Isfahan, and ended up in Gurezar of Iraq. This dispersion and other migrations, including to the US, throughout history have shaped my ancestry today. So as I was doing this research for the book, I recognized two things which are defining characteristic for Armenians and their diaspora. And here's what I realized. A defining characteristic of Iranian Armenian diaspora, consciousness and liminality, is a highly developed ability to negotiate identity within a codified legal hierarchy. In Iran, within an ethno-religious hierarchy, and in the US, within a racial one. So as Christians in Muslim-majority Iran, Armenians define their identity by its ethno-religious minoritized status within Iranian official narratives. When Iranian Armenians enter the US, they are defined according to their racial status. In the US, just like other Middle Easterners, Armenians are considered a white ethnic minoritized group. Yet they are lumped together with Muslim Middle Easterners through our passports, because our passport says Iranian, and subjected to the US racism and Islamophobia, which is interesting because Islamophobia is based on religion, Islam, and Armenians as Christian don't identify with that, but they are subjected to it. Migration from Iran to the US only transforms rather than remedies its predicament, shifting it from a religious to a racial minoritization. Hence, in both national contexts, Iranian Armenians must negotiate identity within a codified legal hierarchy that constructs them as the other or the inauthentic citizens. In practice, this translates into a host nation that carefully guards the coveted space of citizenship and excludes minoritized members. Even when these minoritized and marginalized members are legally citizens, they do not hold economic, cultural, or political power. In this case, they are not actually negotiating identity with a codified legal hierarchy. They do indeed hold citizenship in the codified legal sense, but are culturally excluded. Okay, a little bit about the cultural productions, moving from the personal parts and the reasons I basically wrote the book. I want to start with Lilith Derian. On these slides, I also have added some poetry, but I'm not going to read them for the sake of time. So Lilith Derian, an Iranian Armenian sculptor referred to as the mother of modern Iranian sculpture, honors her Armenian ancestors by evoking the collective shared consciousness. Drawing on the significance of important figures in Armenian cultural heritage, Derian has created a memorial of Mesrop Mashtots, the inventor of the Armenian alphabet that was installed in the Surp Turkmanchat, or Holy Translators Church in Tehran in 1992. So this is the image on the right. Mesrop Mashtots, as the teacher who gave Armenians their alphabet and primary language tool, the cornerstone of Armenianness. So the cornerstones of Armenianness are the language and the religion, which happened in 4th and 5th century. Is celebrated annually in Iranian Armenian schools in Iran. Derian has also sculpted Yeprem Davitian or Yeprem Khan, an Iranian Armenian revolutionary who was active during the Constitutional Revolution of Iran in 1905 to 11. This sculpture was installed in the Surp Asvatazin, or Holy Mary Church of Tehran in 1968. Yeprem Khan is known as a hybrid and bicultural figure. In sculpting his bust and honoring his endeavors in Iranian history, Derian acknowledges her own Iranian Armenianness as well as his. For his contributions to the Constitutional Revolution, Yeprem Khan was made the Chief of Police of Tehran, an unusual role for a Christian in a Muslim country, technically forbidden under the Islamic law. Yeprem Khan was also promoted by the Dashnaks, the Armenian national political party, as an exemplary martyr for the Constitutional Revolution, even though he had left the party in the years leading up to his assassination. Yeprem Khan advocated for the global class struggle and encouraged Iranian Armenians to think of themselves as Iranians first and foremost. He emphasized that he held his Iranian identity above his Christian Armenian identity, especially when opponents questioned the legitimacy of non-Muslims holding such high office. This is something that Chakhnavarian has also done, saying that don't call me Armenian, I am Iranian first, because when you call people with these minoritized labels, you're basically excluding them either consciously or unconsciously. So why I'm looking at these two images is because Lilith Derian is showing the core of like Armenianness and also Iranianness in these two. But now I want to look at another work by Derian, which is, I'm showing you the argument of the book, that sometimes these authors and artists are focusing on exact Armenianness, the core of Armenianness, Armenian language, Armenian nation. But then there are works which are global and transnational. That is how I'm arguing that they have moved from, the nationalism to the transnationalism, basically. So this is another work by Lilith Derian. Lilith Derian's sculptures exhibit both traditional sculptural detail and abstract constructions. Derian's busts of Mesrop Mashtots and Yeprem Khan, which I just discussed, reflect their mastery of a realistic technique that embraces her Armenian and Iranian cultural aspects. However, her more cosmopolitan modernist figures exhibit characteristics of surrealism and cubism. They have been compared to the work of sculptor and painter Alberto Giacometti. The majority of these sculptures are large and reinforced and plastered with wire and thick linen threads, and many present three figures. The figures larger than life scale makes them seem real and tangible, yet fragile, imaginary, and inaccessible. The quick strokes of the hand and the knife give the surface of the work a rough texture replete with spongy cavities. These hard yet porous figures allude to the decay and gradual deterioration of the human form, and by extension to the hardships and sufferings of modern people, compounded by the fragility and roughness of the human condition, both physical and existential. The themes of decay and loss are heightened by the sculptor's materials, the way in which they allude to fullness but shaped cavities. As part of Derrida's modernist works, they were meant to function as a reflection on the emptiness of modern life. So this work, for example, embodies that global aspect. When you look at this sculpture, you will not find anything ethnic in it. So you would not know that this is by an Armenian or Iranian artist. Another work of art that I want to focus on is by Garnik Hakopian. So in this image by Garnik Hakopian, we see an Armenian coffee pot, which stands in as a staple of Armenianness. The pomegranate as a symbol of fertility is associated with both Armenia and Iran. And some lattice work frames in the background, inspired by the artist's mother's crochet work and embroidery, are reminiscent of an Armenian hajkar, if you know what hajkar is. These symbols coalesce to illuminate a concern with traditions, roots, and heritage. At the same time, the inclusion of the frames that say water and juice in English seem jarring and disruptive. However, this illustrates the amalgamation of the classical and the modern, disintegration and integration, Armenian, Iranian, and English. Such combinations grant diasporic Iranian Armenians the symbolic power to transcend and reach beyond their ethnic minoritized status, all the while conveying a community that has both historical roots and ancestral heritage outside the host nation's time and space. Another work by Garnik Hakopian is one of my favorites. You have to look at this image from, in very, in details, because there's so much in this image to talk about. When you look at this image, at surface value, you won't think that, this speaks to global audience. You won't think that there is anything specifically ethnic in this image, because it's called immigration. You have this wording immigrants on the face of this figure, and everyone can connect with this work. However, when you look at this very closely, you see themes of Armenianness there. This is Garnik Hakopian's 1985 mixed media composition titled Emigration, which reconfigures Edward Monet's The Scream. While Monet's opus is recognized as an expression of the anxiety of the human condition, Hakopian chronicles the many adversities faced by diasporic immigrants. In his own words, in depicting figures such as this one in this painting, and I'm quoting, I have left realism behind. Turning to eerie illustrations, especially where I portray faces and bodies in a distorted and exaggerated fashion. So the aggressive and rebellious element is especially strong in these works. I have hidden what I intended to say behind a veil of vagueness, trying to be implicit, end quote. To him, these bizarre figures tell a bitter story about the turbulent world inside them. So some of my analysis, carved across the face of this figure is the word immigrants. The left eye is being pulled at the corner by a hand, and the right eye is upside down. A commentary on the perspectives disrupted by the many pull and push factors that diasporic people face and the resulting limbo of glancing back while struggling to move forward. There are several nails in the face of the figure reminiscent of crucified limbs nailed to a structure. A larger nail pierces the open mouth of the figure, signifying that although it is capable of speech, it has been rendered voiceless. The left edge of the painting features many skull-like shapes with shadows, reminding us of the deceased 1915 genocide victims. An allusion to a khachkar, often found in Armenian churches and cemeteries, fills the upper left corner, tying the skeletal figures to their ancestors. So what khachkar is, it's a feature of medieval Armenian art, which is a small architectural monument elaborately carved with a cross atop a rosette, standing on a pedestal facing west. Throughout the image, we also see rubble, which reminds us of loss. And then there are fragments of newsprint or printed books on the nose of the figure that may refer to fragmented history, problematizing the question of who writes history and who writes our diaspora. So, the research shows that mostly the history of genocide has been written by the oppressor rather than, the oppressed, or any kind of revolution or any kind of, mass executions. So the next work I want to look at, and this is the last artist I'm looking into, is Marco Grigorian, who probably is the most popular or famous artist, Iranian Armenian artist. Marco Grigorian uses dried earth to refer to the loss of homeland. Using soil, and not any particular one, straw and wood bound by polyester and paint as a symbol of eternal life, Grigorian creates two-dimensional works inspired by the earth. He elevates materials harvested from the earth as the highest source of human creativity, symbolizing his personal philosophies through soil. Utilizing dried clay and soil as symbols of life and the sun, these works describe the creation of earth and the sky and express the union of soul and body during the human creation. His dried earth works are an interpretation of inner symbols that signify unity with the universe. The use of earth and clay evokes associations with geography, territory, and nation. Grigorian attempts to establish a sense of security after the loss of a homeland with a newly shaped bit of earth. In this way, Grigorian seems to reach back imaginatively to a lost homeland by making earthen art that speaks about stability within universality. Gregorian also alludes to geometry with squares and spirals, which refer to his signature theme of mystical teachings and a combination of knowledge, hope, and love. According to Iranian artist Fereshteh Daftari, Gregorian's innovative works and his use of ethnic textures were key contributions to modernism. Focusing on minimalist structured geometry, Gregorian's artistic vision would introduce concepts and styles central to pop art in Iran. So, and when you look at this, even though this is evoking homeland, it's not saying Armenian homeland or Iranian homeland, not any, it can be any homeland for any diasporic person or immigrant. And another work by Gregorian refers to the shared history and collective consciousness of Armenians, but it also transcends to global kind of. This is influenced by events of the World War II and the massacres of Armenians and one immigrants, including his own family. Gregorian's family was impacted by the one massacres. Gregorian creates large canvases whose deformed subjects intensify the emotional burden of the artist's grief. Gregorian's painting, this one, The Gate of Auschwitz, part of a series of 13, artistically expresses the German Nazi regime's crimes and concentration camps. In this series, Gregorian depicts human relationships and catastrophes. His early works, including these Auschwitz murals, present a visual language that expresses anxiety and despair, conveying potent images of the cruelty of war and the inevitability of death and decay. Gregorian's early expressionist works incorporate skillful drawing technique with mixtures of paint and ash, depicting deformed limbs and facial features to emphasize the tragic fate of immigrants from one and victims of Armenian genocide, as well as the Holocaust reaching another nation. So what I tried to show with all these images and the paintings and sculptures was there are some Armenian poorness, but there are also this transnational global aspects. The way I concluded the book is by saying that all these artists and authors find finally home in their writing or in their creative work. And I will just give an example by Azad Matian, where he finds a home in writing. Writing gives him the power to fight for belonging, the right to remember, while also fighting to be remembered. And here he says, I don't have an address. I've been deported from 7 courts. I carry my home like a turtle. No, I carry my home like a poem within me, and I frequently lose my way. And this image of the turtle with its husk on its back is symbolic because it's talking about displacement and constant mobility with your home on your back. But this is also the same imagery that Gloria Anzaldúa uses to describe their own concept of home. So it's interesting how these authors and artists reach beyond their ethnic minoritized status to global concepts, even if it might be unconscious, because I imagine Azad Matian used this concept before Gloria Anzaldúa probably used it. But then he moves even further and says, no, it is in my poem, not in the turtle status. Yeah, and I translated this from Armenian. So thank you so much.
Outstanding and very inspiring.
Thank
you very much. I'm certain there are several questions here. Colleagues, yes?
Thank you so much for that very intimate and personal narrative that, of course, had the transnational elements in it as well. You have art, and it's very interesting. I'm very motivated to read the book and
Thank you.
and then comment on it. But just because of curiosity, so this idea of transnational Armenianism, how do you see it? I mean, in the arts that you described, some of the elements, you said they're local colors, but at the same time, there are translocal, transnational elements. For example, if you meet another Armenian who was maybe who had lived in Cyprus or Turkey, in the location of the original trauma, or in other, do you have like elements of transnationalism that connects you? Of course, I mean, it could be cuisine or culture or religion. I don't know. What is this?
Thank you for your comments and the question. The core of Armenianness, as I said, lies within the Christian religion and the language. And they were the foundations were basically laid in 4th and 5th century. And those became identity markers for Armenians as a nation. Because Armenia is believed to be the first nation that accepted Christianity as their national religion. So they pride themselves of this. Sometimes if you ask Armenians who they are, there's even conflation between I'm Christian and I'm Armenian. They feel like, if I say I'm Armenian, it should be clear to everybody that I'm also Christian. They assume that everyone knows. And then the language with Mesrop Mashtots is also very important aspect of it. So religion and language, which are aspects that I trace in different chapters of this book, how they talk about the significance of Armenian language, how Armenian language is pure, how it is the best language in the world, how all these poets. And you might be familiar with Zoya Pirzad's work. We see in Zoya Pirzad's work where Edmond is criticized for using Persian words or, for the tulip. And Mrs. Grigorian tells him, why are you using, the Persian word for tulip? You have to say qaqach, which is the Armenian word. Or when we read Cherahara Man Khamush Mikonam, when the kids are criticized by the grandmother, why they are saying hello, they have to say baret. And they are using hello because at that time period, 1940s Iran, they're living in the south of Iran where, because of Sherkat Naft, there was a lot of exposure to, English language, and Americans or British, and, they were using English in their everyday speech. The kind of transnational connecting Armenians across the world is the language and the religion. However, today, the cornerstone of that is the genocide. The genocide unifies Armenians across the world. They might find differences in different things because growing up as an Armenian in the Middle East is completely different from growing up, for example, in Europe or in America. So the intersectionality comes into play here, right? Like the impact of where they have been raised. But one thing that they never find differences on is the genocide. And that genocide today, right now, is Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. And we recently saw that, the monastery that fell to Azerbaijan is the first Armenian school funded by Mesrop Mashtots. And this is very significant for Armenians. Right now, they're raising funds to help actually buy coffins for, people, citizens, civilians who died during that bombing of Azerbaijan a couple of days ago. So that's the cornerstone of bridging and bringing everyone together.
I really enjoyed the way you set set up the book by your ancestry.com test and the DNA. My daughter, who's half Native American, had done the same and managed to discover connections to China, to Alaska, and then to my ancestral village, well, our parental village. And from there, met a lot of actual people. Have you done that? Can you
I have
tell us
had,
a little
yes,
bit?
I have had people who have, because it tells you, your first cousins or your second cousins, or you might be,
Connected to
related to this person or to that person. There are some even like Americanized names there. I've had someone who contacted me from Australia saying it looks like we're cousins, and she gave me all this information, and I asked my mom, and we might be like not even second cousins, probably fourth, fifth, but not very closely related. And of course, I have some of my first cousins also there who have done their DNA ancestry, and they're listed exactly there. So it's interesting. And then the DNA ancestry works very interestingly. Like, it's fun to have it because every once in a while it gives you updates on different things. For example, it tells me what I would probably, based on their research and everything they have collected, that I should be allergic to this food or to that food, or like I should be a night owl or early bird or things like that, which some of those things are true. They sound familiar to me, but some of them are really, not. So it's very interesting.
Another aspect of your ancestral connection is with the city of Arad. I have done a lot of work on the carpet industry there and how it developed, and the large community of Armenians that were there and then became sort of international merchants, both involved in the production of carpet and its international trade. And I am confident that there is a lot of documents available. And I have masked some of them, that you could make actual historical connections if your parents had come from Guruzar, Arad, Guruzar to Tehran. This can be really traced.
The next book.
Yeah. Okay.
So just to give some context, right now I'm working on Iranian Armenian women and their life stories. I'm doing autoethnography of my life, and then oral history interviews with all these other women. And of course, including there is my grandmother and my parents, not my dad, my mom, and all of them also from Iraq. So I'm pretty sure that would be useful for me.
Actually, the Iraq part, carpet production, I'm confident that there must have been carpet producer doing actual weaving. And there must have been in this Armenian villages and workshops that you could bring that into.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I also really like the personal experiences and this searching for our own past or your own past, because it really fits your historical anthropological kind of work. And I wanted to ask about the gendered layers of your work, of this book, whether you have discussed those or you have another project. But, okay.
So unfortunately, yes, in this book, or maybe intentionally, in this book, I didn't focus on the gender aspect as much. I mean, I do have women artists and, but I didn't want to add additional, lens to look at these things from the gender aspect of it. but the next book is specifically only on Iranian Armenian women. So of course there I will have the gender. But about the methodology, it took a lot of courage. I almost was sure that the proposal will be rejected because academia is, as we know, not very, welcoming of personal. They say you're too close to it, so you're not objective, and so they don't look at it as academic work, probably.
Or not this history.
Yeah, but the fellowship that I said helped me immensely in these things. All my co-fellows were like, no, you have to tell your stories. And the stories at the beginning I had put at the end of each chapter, they said, no, they have to come at the beginning to set the stage for each chapter. Those are the highlights. So I added the prologue and then, introduction, and each chapter opens with my own story about the chapter's theme. So when it's about the genocide, I talk about my experience in Iran when we would demonstrate, and we wouldn't go to classes, school during that day, April 24th, the day of commemoration, and then they would deduct from our Numre Enzabat. Yeah, that from 20 it would go down to 15 every year.
You said it really well. 15.
Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah. I was always a good student, so it was 20. So, and then the chapter about language and, the kind of language assimilation and those kinds of things, I talk about language, my experience, and how we were demonstrating to have language classes basically at school because the Islamic Republic shut down all the Armenian instruction. And Elisa Nasarian has talked about extensively about all the policies and what happened. So I'm drawing so much from her work.
Thank you so much for your inspiring and interesting presentation. I really look forward to reading your book. So I have two major questions.
Oh my God,
the first
warning, major.
The first is that I also want to learn a little bit more about those artists, Iranian Armenian artists, particularly related to their social and economic background, whether they were self-funded, because arts is money, right?
Yeah.
Whether they were supported by some patrons or institutional support. And the second question is whether you had come by any comparative observation when you did your research, for example, this relationship with other religious or ethnic minorities within Iran or outside Iran, this relationship to broader Armenian community, because in case of Iranian Jews, for example, their relationship to Iran kind of change when they move out of the country because of the existence of Israel and other Ashkenazis or Sephardic Jews outside of countries. So I wonder if you could tell more about it.
So thank you for your questions. Each one of the artists that I discuss, I give the background story about them too. So some of them are 17th century, the Shah Abbas, part of the Armenians who were brought to Iran. Some of them are like Marco Grigorian. After the one massacres, the family was displaced. Some of them are, for example, Sonia Balasanian, part of the exact group of Armenians like my ancestors moving from Jolfa, Isfahan to Iraq, and they were absorbed into the carpet weaving and rug industry. So the social class is very different. It varies, and the kinds of migrations to Iran, some of them might be even indigenous Iranians never came because they were in the Persian Empire within Iran already, right? In Urmia, Tabriz, or those parts who consider themselves as indigenous. And the social class was different. So some of them could afford or had access to move to Europe and be educated and come back. So not everybody was like low working class, like Chiknabarian, for example, got education from Europe and then came back to Iran and worked for Pahlavi regime. That I have tried to acknowledge, maybe a little bit subtly. The connection with other Armenians across the world, or other, nations, maybe, Jewish community or other Iranians, is not that dominant or prevalent. It can be, for example, seen in their works, like the one that I looked at with the Holocaust, that they're trying to kind of connect, but in their own words, you will not find something that they say this is the intention. However, they're doing that, right? And then in terms of Armenian, I didn't observe any direct intertextuality or anything like that, other than like the mythical figures, or other than the major figures like Omidyar, for example, who's the Ashu from years ago, like the troubadour of Armenians, which is the classical music of Armenians, with hymns and all that. There's so many references, for example, to Omidyar. I looked at some cinematic works by R.B. Theravanesian, or R.B. Avanesian, and he uses Omidyar's music in in Qare Kelisa, or the other work he has, Cheshme. Qare Kelisa is a beautiful documentary. It has been documented as a national heritage place now. Yeah.
Who should go first? Go ahead. Okay. I know that Nagar has a better question than I do. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Yaghoobi, about hyphens. And that was a really interesting thing in the book. You talk about, so yesterday when we spoke, you said that you were shocked that I had read your book, but not only did I read the book, I read the footnotes as well. That's how much I liked it, and I encourage everyone to do the same. I was thinking about what you said, and it was interesting because it was in the context of the Iran-Iraq war, which was hyphenated. You removed the hyphens in the book, and I want you to speak to that. But I was thinking also about how this plays out in language, and you said that very interestingly, how language is a marker of Armenian identity across the board. And I was thinking about Persian, where we have izafet, for instance, right, which is an inclusive, most of the time possessive kind of marker. And in English, the hyphen is a means to sort of divide, as you put it. And so you say, I'm against hyphens. So I'm thinking in this sort of movement for dehyphenization, which I would like to join, what role does Armenian play in that discussion? And is there some kind of strategy that scholars and your readers could employ to sort of take part in that movement? Because I was really fascinated by this comment in a footnote that you made about hyphens. Thank you.
Well, first, thank you for reading the book. It gives me such joy to, see people reading the book, because as scholars, when you write a book, you think it's gone into the world and nobody else is going to read it. So thank you for reading it. I mean, Dr. Tavakkoli knows, in the field of Iranian studies, I have tried to be disruptive, to disrupt certain narratives that are mainstream, basically, with trying to move away from Persian centrism, trying to move away from heterosexism, trying to create a dialogue between Iranian literature and global literature, like putting in the context of world literature. So that is another way of disrupting, because I was looking at, and the first draft, actually, there was hyphens. And I had to go through, maybe it was in the middle of the book that I was like, I don't like this, hyphenation. So what should I do? And I had to go through again to delete all of those hyphens, because I feel like when you say Iranian, Armenian, and you put hyphen there, it looks like someone that is broken into two parts. But I wasn't feeling as someone who's broken into two parts, and today into three, right? Iranian, Armenian, American. So I have to take that away to make myself a whole with all of those aspects and more, because add to that the intersection of gender, class, also sexuality, all sorts of other things, right? The position we occupy today, like as a professor, privileged in a university, all those things play a role there. So this is a complete version of who you are. So I tried to disrupt that. And then I, obviously for reviewers and everyone, I had to give a footnote to explain why I'm doing that. And I also tried to disrupt the fact that we're not always saying Iranian, Armenian. Sometimes in the book, I reverse it, Armenian, Iranian. So trying to disrupt is the way to go. It's difficult. Sometimes we are critiqued, but it's okay. As long as, you stick with your values and integrity, and you know what you're doing, you can defend yourself. I don't know if I answered your question, though.
You did. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for writing the book. I mean, I have to repeat that. What a nice book. It sort of weaves the historical with the narration of the book. And what stood out to me in the introduction part was when you talked about how you as a child viewed, and how your view was different from the elderly who were like, okay, you're at a safe place, but as a child you were like, I'm thinking about my father who's not at a safe zone. That really stood out to me. And thank you for writing this and I don't know, publishing this book, because many of these artists, I didn't know them at all. Thank you for that. And the question I have is, I suppose some of these artists lived inside Iran. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Garnik Derhakopian specifically with the immigrant image.
Okay.
He sent me these images via WhatsApp.
Wow.
So these are like courtesy of the artist himself. Yeah.
So I wanted to know if you have also talked about it in the book, how comfortable they were producing their art, and how living in Iran might have changed the thematic core of their works, or maybe they had to delete or suppress, maybe if they want to show or display corporealities or physical interactions in their artwork, if it has affected their work.
Thank you so much for the question and all the appreciation comments. I haven't personally asked for their ideas because I don't want to put them in danger also, like quoting them directly, but there are works published right now about all of these artists almost. Someone who works is Ruin Pagbaz, and another person, I will give you the name later. I can't recollect the name. They have like volumes of works, specifically on the works of Garnik Derhakopian. Absolutely, I've talked about the fact that, there are things that they cannot talk about. There is the self-censorship and also official censorship. that impacts, right? But then when they come to diaspora in the US, it's easier to obviously work on these topics. There's also the topic of reception. And like, as you say, you didn't know about these artists, and they have been working forever. I will give you one example. Sonia Balasanian lives in New York. In 1982-83, she has done amazing works on Iranian women, Iranian hostage crisis, Iran-Iraq war, the hijab, the veiling, everything. The cover of our Me Too book, the volume, is a work by Sonia, which is a collage with her own photograph and all these scripts and stuff. A decade later, Shirin Neshat used the same style. No acknowledgement of Sonia. And nobody even knows. And look where she is and where Sonia is. And Sonia mentioned it to me. She said, people have
That makes a good article.
People have I can't ruffle more feathers.
Oh, don't worry about it. You're used to it.
She mentioned it to me by saying that people have copied her. She didn't name without any acknowledgement, but she is a passionate artist. She's, I think, 86 years old, and every day in her studio to this day. So for the AIS symposium, online symposium in October, I'm actually intentionally going to present a paper about this and bring those images by Sonia next to Shirin Neshat in my presentation. No paper yet, but but the presentation.
That's good. All right, please.
Thank you so much for your, especially for the introduction. It took me like back to my memories that I have from Iran. It was very emotional. I have a question and I have a comment. For the first question, in continuation with Ulma and Nagar, because it's related to the artwork. Do you think that the thriving of the Armenian art characteristics and themes are more in Pahlavi period rather than Islamic period? Because at that moment of the time, the Pahlavi period was the stage for the artists, and they were just kind of exploring themselves and also expressing themselves in their own way. And there are lots of Iranian themes and characteristic Persians, especially, are being like displayed and presented.
You mean the Persian?
Yeah. I just want to see if you think that, like, the Armenian characteristics are more pronounced.
Thank you. So in the book, my goal was to focus on the past 40 years because there are two prominent other scholars who are working on constitutional period and the Pahlavi period at this moment on a book, Talin Grigor and Uli Berberian. They have presented their work in different conferences, and they have given lots of talks. Amazing work they are doing, which is on Iranian women also, so the gender aspect during those times. And they're looking at archival material and the history and everything, the journals and archives. So I didn't want to go to those periods and just focus on this period to actually kind of complement each other's work rather than to be in competition. I definitely see some of the things, for example, some of the works from Arbit Eravanesian and Marco Grigorian. I also have some of their works from the Pahlavi era, which laid the ground for later works. And you're right, those had more ethnic aspects in them. For example, Marco Grigorian has this one image, let me see if I can show it to you, which is Sangak, Barbari, very beautiful. It is called Albushta Dizi. This is from 1968. Yeah. So that clearly shows that, there is this Persian Iranian identity right there, 1968. And you're absolutely right. I heard a very funny story. I mean, I read a funny story about this. Apparently, it was brought as an exhibition. This is not a painting; it's actual Barbari, or in another image, it is Sangak, for example. They brought it to New York for an exhibition, and they didn't know that the Sangak and Barbari can have, yeah. So.
And my comment is that the last painting from Gregorian is just reminding the painting of Picasso from Guernica, 1937, when they found the northern eastern part, the northern western part of the Spain. So it's much very different, and I'm going to show it to you like after the.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. We're very thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much. I'm thinking through history, Armenian history. It was always divided between two empires: Byzantines, Sasanians, Parthians, all the way to today. I mean, during Safavid time, it was divided between three empires: Russians, Ottomans, and Persians.
They have actually, in historical documentation, been called the intermediaries.
Exactly. Would that have an effect on the psyche of the Armenians? And would you call Armenians, to my very limited knowledge, Armenians are cosmopolitan rather than, although I'm always comparing them to the Jewish diaspora. Jews have a saying that next year in Jerusalem. Armenians, I don't think they have a saying that next year in Yerevan, right? No. So what is, you showed the turtle, and so beside the religion and the language, which is the homeland since immemorial time, basically, what else could be the homeland? Is it art? Is it culture? So if tomorrow, God forbid, an empire comes and take over Armenia of today as the land, beside the language and the religion, what would cement the identity of Armenians, not only in Armenia or in the vicinity of Armenia, which are close, but what else would be there for Armenians to hang on to?
I mean, that's a great question, actually, but I can't think of anything else other than those two and the genocide. Because historically, it's always been those three. And of course, today Glendale in Los Angeles is cementing them all together. But I really don't think as you were talking, I'm thinking about food, but I can't, because there is Russian influence in the food, and for us from Iran, it's mostly Persian, very different from the food that is like the Armenian food in Armenia, basically. And there's absolutely, you're right, no desire to go back to Armenia. There's a part about Azad Matyan where I write, Azad Matyan was this pan-Armenian person when he was in Iran. He used to teach at Danishgah Isfahan. He was teaching Armenian there in Jolfab. And he's also a very good sculptor. He does have sculpting too. Right now, he lives in Glendale. Why? Because his son immigrated and he had no other choice with his wife. They immigrated. Robert Safarian made a great documentary film of his life, and they are having conversations, and they're walking through all the streets of New Julfa, and going to the university, sculptures. در فاصله دو کوه or دو کوی. He says that in a story he writes, Azad Matian, that in 1994, when Armenia became independent of Russia, he went there because he was so like this fiery pan-Armenian, we have to go there, mother nation, blah, blah. He goes there 6 months, leaves. In the documentary, he says that Armenians themselves inside Armenia don't want us. Why would I go? So he's moved away from that pan-Armenianness, and he's like, I'm not going to return to Armenia. I'm not going to live there. I'm going to be where my family is, my son is. So maybe family.
Just jumping in at these traces, for example, when you think of religion, churches, for example, famous church in Julfa, famous church in Iraq, at the heart of the Bazaar of Tehran, there is one of the oldest Armenian church, and it was Kuche where I grew up. And all of these are traces that have remained. Regard the Kuche Armenian Tehran to Bazaar has become radically transformed, but the church is there.
Church remains.
And there is a sign and a trace and a visible architectural connection that can always be woven to narratives of various types.
And that church has a lot of significance because usually, I don't know the exact date, but it's in Mehma, in fall. There is one day that it's called, if I'm not wrong, Saint Grigor Day, and everyone goes there, and they have just like. Iranians, they have Nazr, they vow something and they stop eating or things like that and stay. My grandma every year would go and stay the night there. Everyone sits together and they talk to each other and, all night. And there are some like rituals and religious ceremonies, and you go and get your cross and yeah. So the church has even a day for it. And there's also a nursing home next to the church where they keep the elderly who don't have family members. So we would go and donate money to help them because they had no family.
My elementary school was next to the church. Thank you very much. Sorry, the last question.
Sure. Thank you very much. Very impressive. Heart-touching, and as everybody mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question about the idea of home that you, the last words that you were mentioning about that quotation from that artist that they carry my home with myself. I want to first make the clarification that were you thinking of that idea of home that is being more globalized because these artists and writers are trying to find homes through their writings? Or is that what you were trying to? And don't you think there is a distinction between this idea that this is different than when you are thinking you're having a home that you are carrying with yourself? And it's different than thinking of, the whole world is my home. In other words, I mean, thinking of having to have a global identity or a global home. Maybe you can, because you reminded me, I remember when I was undergrad, we were reading some passage selection from Samuel Huntington in A Clash of Civilization, and he was predicting that in the future people the identity gonna be more religious rather than to be national, because it's something that people carry with themselves.
Yeah.
So it reminded me of that idea. However, I have the feeling that it is different than thinking, I belong to the world, rather than finding a safe spot or zone that you feel, okay, this is where I am coming from, which is an alternative to what's happening.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's not that kind of, oh, the entire world is my home.
Yeah.
It is that I have found home in
Some-
this specific thing.
Yeah.
And it comes up a lot in different artists and different authors who are saying that, you know, their writing, their creation is their home.
Yeah.
And again, when like I'm asked, everybody asks me every time I get an interview, they're like, so where do you consider home today?
Yeah.
And I confuse because when I want to talk about Tehran, I talk about Los Angeles. When I want to talk about Los Angeles, I'm talking about Tehran. But I'm never talking about Chapel Hill, where I actually live. And the reason for that is the concept of family unit. I think I see home where my parents are.
Well, Professor Yaghoobian, thank you for your inspiring book and presentation. It has been an honor to have you here the last couple of days.
Thank you so much. An honor for me. This is the first book launch, official book launch. I have given a lot of, talks about this book before its publication. And of course, great questions. I bragged so much about these papers that I heard, I listened to all the presentations yesterday. So thank you so much for including me in the conference for today and all of it.
And my apologies that we didn't have a much larger turnout because of the Sunday after exhausting everyone with our series of events in the last
Well,
few days.
this was more intimate and great questions.
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank
Have
you.
more questions waiting for us.
Yes.
It's,
All right.
Thank you. It's so great to receive like informed questions because when I present this, usually I get Iranians who are like, no, but we have neighbors who are Armenian and we were so good and we were playing football with each other and we were doing this. So it goes down that hill. Yeah.
Very good.
So this was great questions in terms of, asking about really things that for the next book will be important.
Awesome. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.